General Colin Powell, who served under 4 presidents, died earlier this morning at the age of 84. After a 35-year career, Powell retired from the Army in 1993 as a 4-star general. He then served as a statesman at top leadership positions. He was National Security Advisor under President Reagan, the first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and the first black Secretary of State under President George W. Bush. In post-9/11 America, he's remembered with 2 pivotal moments. First, one, his 2003 presentation to the United Nations Security Council as the Secretary of State, as he claimed Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction, claims which he later publicly regretted as they were based on faulty intelligence. The second, he endorsed candidate Barack Obama as the next president over John McCain and criticized right-wing media for questioning if Obama was a closeted Muslim. He died from complications of COVID-19. Though he was vaccinated, his immune system was weakened by multiple treatments for blood cancer. Joining me now to discuss Powell's life and his legacy are BNC Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Nayyera Haq and Melik Abdul. He is a political commentator and a GOP strategist. Welcome to the show, both of you. Melik, I'm going to start with you. As a general turned statesman, who was Colin Powell?
Well, Colin Powell was a lion, and he crossed politics, whether you're Democrat, Republican, white, or black. If you actually think about the era in which Colin Powell was raised, joined the military, fought in our wars, to really ascend up the ladder as he did, it's a remarkable feat for any American, particularly someone with, I think he was from New York City, I believe, with Jamaican immigrants as parents. So it really is America's story all over again. So he was a very proud man. He was a very accomplished man, but many would argue that he was a very principled man. So there have been a lot of conversations about Colin Powell, and we won't be able to give enough time here or even in the memorials that will be held in his honor to really give a sense of just how much of a lion Colin Powell was. But he was a remarkable man with a remarkable story, and he will truly be missed.
Nayyera, talk to me about General Powell's impact on foreign policy. Again, he was a national security advisor. He's been Secretary of State. He's had multiple roles, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When you look at all of those roles, he clearly was not only a participant, but an active, maybe even architect of much of American foreign policy over the last few decades. Talk to me about his impact.
And it's an indelible impact on U.S. foreign policy and the role of the U.S. military on the world stage. It's part of how he came up. He credits the Army with being what gave him clarity and purpose in life. He served in Vietnam. It's where he started to advise senior leaders. That's also where he learned how to be a staffer. And he was part of the discussion around the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, where U.S. soldiers had been accused of killing civilians. So he was there in the thick of these discussions that had big political passions around them, but also needed a path forward. But at the end of the day, even though he went to the White House with Nixon, he was National Security Advisor for Reagan, he was still part of the Republican project, the military national security project that saw him playing a key role in U.S. military intervention in Latin America, for example, that saw him engaging in the Iraq War. He did develop the Powell Doctrine, and that was the idea that you had to exercise everything else first: diplomacy, policy, economic, use all of the other foreign policy tools before you use military action. And when you use military action, it has to be swift and sure and with an eye to the cost, the human cost of victory. So at the end of the day, he was a good soldier. The irony is that as the good soldier, he served people who were more war hawks, who had never served, than he was. He was often the dove in the room, and that duality is really what brought him to that infamous 2003 moment that he later said it was the blot on his career. That was his biggest mistake in service, was passing on faulty intelligence and being the face for what ended up being the biggest lie of the war on terror.
Melik, how do you sort of make sense of that? You've talked about Powell as a lion. You've talked about him as someone who's had a distinguished military career and someone who has served his country. At the same time, to Nayyera's point, this is also someone who was the face of an imperial war, the face of a war that was based on the premise of there being weapons of mass destruction. There's an argument that he was misled. There's an argument that he was part of the duplicity. But whether he was tricked or whether he was dishonest, in either case, he played an active role in military interventions that cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. Not to mention the My Lai massacre, not to mention his role as a soldier, again, a good soldier, in quelling black resistance in the 60s, not to mention excursions in Latin America. But we could go across the board here. How do you jive this memory of someone who was a trailblazer, who many people admired and loved, with a record that maybe doesn't stand up to certain kinds of scrutiny?
Well, I think it's a case that really much, whether you're talking about Colin Powell or really any of our leaders, just over time, there's a lot of complexity to their lives and a lot of decisions that were made. Some of them will be criticized much later on in life, and then there are others who at the time these leaders would be criticized for. So it extends beyond Colin Powell, whether that is someone, there's a lot of discussion about Scalia, his impact on the court. But of course, there is a larger discussion that people have in the community about Scalia's impact on race in society. So I think for many of us, Colin Powell will be another in that long line of complex leaders, or leaders where there's a larger discussion that we can have beyond where we see that they erred. Obviously, Colin Powell's the most in the past, probably 15 or 20 years, he's most remembered for him actually going before the UN and convincing our allies there at the UN to join us in the war. So that is a permanent stain on his history, absolutely. But I don't think that we should negate everything else that Colin Powell did, even for the simple reason that I mentioned, that people are complex and our leaders are complex. There are many people who voted for that same war who now have a different position now. So I think we should be able to allow those type of discussions to talk about where they erred, but don't allow that to detract from the larger purpose that they served, whether that was in a good or a bad way. I do think in Colin Powell's case, it was a very good way. And despite the stain on his, that asterisk that will forever be attached to him about what he did there at the UN, I think Colin Powell's overall history, being able to do everything that he was able to do and live a very full life, I think that ultimately is a discussion I would like to have, not taking for granted everything else that he did as far as shaping U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy.
And Marc, I'll jump in to say this.
Nayyera, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, and to take that complexity further, General Powell came up in a time where just being a black person in the system was a real BFD. It did not exist, and even someone like Reverend Jesse Jackson acknowledged the importance of having somebody on the inside, people agitating on the outside. Now, we would 40 years later, after he first started his career, look at it a little differently of how somebody uses their power when they're at the table. But Colin Powell was that person who believed that being in the system was better than being on the outside, and he remains the only person from that administration. He was not the one calling the shots. He was the public face, but he's the only one who's taken any sort of accountability for those decisions made in the Iraq War. And last but not least, he has never forgotten that he came from the South Bronx and returned there regularly to encourage other young people to meet the challenges, to live the American dream. In Colin Powell's case, that American dream was through the military complex.
It's a complicated story. It's an interesting story, and one that we're going to continue to cover here at Black News Tonight. Nayyera, Melik, thank you so much for joining me.